Salam alaikum. Good morning to all of you here in the auditorium and all of you who are online. I'm Vishakha Desai, and I've had the great pleasure of being back at the institution that I was honored to have led and worked for 22 years. But it's particularly special for me to be here this morning because it brings me back more as an art historian, a scholar, to focus on a subject that I began to explore as a graduate student, a doctoral student, many, many decades ago. You don't want to know how long. But the reality is that this subject of Mughal aesthetic is something that really is not only important for us to think in the context of South Asia, particularly also because of the importance of Lahore in that context, but it's particularly important because how we think about that word. So when I thought of the title with my friends, especially Zehra and Mehreen, who thought of this notion of Lahore as Palimpsest, that idea of Palimpsest is particularly relevant even when we think about the word Mughal. Because what does the word mean? Palimpsest is really about, as Oxford English Dictionary defines it, is about having something that has visible layers that are apparent even beneath the surface. So it's about layering. It's about diversity, out of which we understand both historicity, but also things that are alive multiple times all at the same time. So one might think that the word Mughal in itself is also a palimpsest, that it is that idea of multiple traditions coming together in a syncretic way that I feel is the best of the subcontinent. So in that sense, one might say the Mughal aesthetic is also about the best of what South Asian culture has to offer to the world. So what we're going to do is to really kind of focus in on the word Mughal often only implies for many people the idea of the patronage. And oftentimes it gets focused in on the religious identity of the patrons. But we don't think about the aesthetic as a process, how artists actually come together from diverse traditions to make something that's new. And that's something we want to focus on because it's also about the practice and out of which new things are created. So my three colleagues, all of whom are wonderful, accomplished, are going to talk about this with you and with me. We're going to try to make it as a conversation. I will ask them questions, but I've been promised that I have 45 minutes, although we started a little late. So we will have also an opportunity for you to engage in the conversation towards the end. So Mehreen, let me start with you as an art historian, a fellow art historian, to really talk to us about that idea of the Mughal aesthetic, and that often we only think about it as the courts. But how does it actually come to be? And you've thought a lot about this. And we're going to have some slides so that things will move around. Pay attention to that. So take it away, Mehreen.
Sure. Okay. So when we're talking about a Mughal aesthetic, there is a very particular style which has emerged, not only in painting, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, but also in terms of other objects of material culture, in terms of architecture as well. And what really defines the Mughal aesthetic is the syncretic nature, this idea of layers that Vishakha just mentioned. Because when the Mughals come into being as a ruling entity, as a courtly culture, they themselves are coming from outside of South Asia. They are coming from a Persianate Timurid heritage, which they then bring with them. Oh, thank you very much. They are also then once they're established as this ruling entity, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that they are a religious minority, just to bring religion into the picture, ruling over a non-Muslim majority. The majority of the population, the majority of the society they're ruling over within this new South Asian context are Hindu practitioners, Jain practitioners, Buddhist practitioners. And so in order to rule, in order to maintain their rule, they have to interact with the society in such a way that it all comes together. And one of the ways in which this is done is through Akbar, the third Mughal emperor, bringing into the courtly hierarchy individuals from the Rajasthani courts, so bringing in the Hindu nobility. But when we turn to the artistic production, when we're talking about the workshops, it is artists from so many different backgrounds and so many different religious backgrounds, backgrounds in training as well. If I go forward for just 1 minute, if you look at the top
right.
Top right.
Or left, your left.
Yeah, top left. This is an example of some of the tradition of the early Rajasthani painting, which is being produced within South Asia prior to the Mughals coming into the region as a ruling entity. And that is just one of the many traditions which then merges together to come and create what we call a Mughal style. We're talking about Persian painting, we're talking about Rajasthani painting, we're talking about Sultanate painting.
That's the thing I think people don't realize, is that you also had Islamic tradition in India, like Nimitnama, early 16th century, long before Mughals were in, along with European traditions. And Tibetan paintings. This is a cosmopolitan thing. Exactly. It's not just one particular religion.
I think one of the things which tends to be forgotten is that the Mughals are not the first Islamic rulers in this region. There's been a Muslim presence in South Asia since 711 with the establishment of Arab settlements or in and around Sindh. And then Islam as a ruling entity is there from the beginning of the 13th century. And so there has been a tradition of this this rulership, again, but combined with the society that is there, living in synchronicity, with the societies that is there.
But that's why I think that what people don't understand is that what is unique about Akbar is the way he goes about doing it. And that changes the equation from other rulers.
No, absolutely.
And that changes what happens after, right? So
he marries into the Rajput nobility.
Exactly.
So the princesses which he marries, they convert to Islam. Their families do not. We've got extensive...
And they still continue to worship in the private places.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the other things which Akbar does in order to help promote this totality of the court is when he is commissioning manuscripts, when the nobility are commissioning manuscripts and illustrated imagery, it's not just for them, it's for this kind of wider audience. So for example, if we look to the to your right, he commissions illustrated versions of Hindu manuscripts,
Ramayana,
which he translates into Persian.
Absolutely.
Exactly, in order to make their scope wider. And so we have at the court these very many different entities. And just as you mentioned as well, Europeans are coming to the court, and there's visual material from Europe coming to the court. And one of the things which distinguishes Mughal painting and the Mughal painting style from the other courts in South Asia, the other Muslim courts as well, is this coming together of these different traditions, because the style of Mughal painting is completely unique at the time in which it is created. And of course, I'm biased, but I think it is one of the most beautiful styles of painting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. But I think that one of the things that happens at the time of partition is who claims this tradition and how does it get, and how, right? Exactly. So part of it is that while the process is one thing, it begins to now get separated out. So one of the things that Shahzia I was really interested in is that when I went to Pakistan in the early 1990s and to be at NCA, but also having met our good friend Salima Hashmi, to recognize that actually NCA was one of the only places in South Asia where there was actually an academic way of looking at miniatures or court paintings in general. And you were right there, along with some of your other colleagues and friends who then now have become big stars on the global stage, including yourself. So talk a little bit about NCA, that notion of certain claiming of the Mughal tradition as more for Pakistan, but also what was happening at NCA at the time.
Well, I started NCA in the 1986-87 session. Now, you have to understand that it's a very different time from the recent years of getting miniature, getting a global stage. It is also Zia's period, so there's a lot of kind of a stagnancy in terms of thought.
And a little bit of concern whether you should look at the South Asian heritage in any particular way or not, right? So
well, of course, I remember in the, the shifts are changed. There's a shift going on, but I think as a very young person, one is gravitating towards the liberal spaces, towards where there's going to be some kind of a space for expression, thought, discussion. So NCA emerges in conversation that's a place. So I was studying mathematics at Kinnaird College for Women, and then decided to go to NCA because of that, not in pursuit of miniature. So
that it's a progressive space and therefore would be comfortable.
So in that respect, gravitating towards miniature is an anomaly because globally and in general, abstract expressionism, an American, European canon of painting is prevalent. And this is pre-internet. And one has yet to travel to India either. It's not like you're saturated in the tourist industry with the kitsch production of the visuals. So there's a handful of books. But I think I was interested in this devotion to tradition and the definition of what exactly is tradition. Like, who gets to define what is tradition in terms of the scale of definability, right? Like, even now, tradition can be very easily replaced with history. So this idea...
And can be manipulated for other reasons.
So this polarizing of sorts, I think, is problematic. But at the same time, it takes years and time and experience to then understand that there is a link to the past. At that time, it's more like, oh, how can you be bold? What is an avant-garde? How do you make a mark? So then it's pitted against this idea of the tradition. But at that time, of course, we all understand and we know that the history, that the miniature painting was not yet the way it has become. It was not that type of an international space of discussion and production. But what I'm also interested is in patronage. So there is a lack of patronage in the 80s also. So, so Bashir, of course, is teaching.
So Bashir's is a portrait on your right.
Yes. But
that's the teacher at NCA.
Bashir Ahmed that's one example of the portraiture of, I think, Saeed Akhtar, the painter. But, inserting portraiture was nothing new. Sheikh Shuja'ullah and Haji Sharif, like, people had been doing that. So I think my early work, which is in, I think, 88 or something, one of is more about, okay, how do you do live sketches? So that's probably, that's a friend of mine, but it was also like this idea of the woman where she's always awaiting. So
which is the Abhisarika night kind of a tradition.
So I was coming to NCA also having been part of Aurat Foundation. Lala Rukh was a big mentor before I joined NCA. In fact, in school, I worked with her at Seymour Foundation. So one's grasp is like the desire to think through art is coming also from the exposure to the movements that are happening locally.
One of the things, Shazia, you've talked about is that how much actually going towards a miniature painting was in itself an act of resistance, since the predominant form is of modernist abstraction, oil painting, and things of that sort.
Of course, but it's not fully accessible. Because we're not yet at a point where there are books and discussions on Pakistani painters, etc. It's pretty lukewarm. This is also when things are just
beginning
germinating,
to emerge,
right?
But it seems to me that it had to do with NCA leadership, who actually thought that we should bring Bashir in, the kind of thing that didn't happen in India.
So Bashir starts, I think he starts in 1982. He graduates in 1976.
And who brings him in?
I think he was the only person after Sheikh Shujaullah passes in 1980. Right. So he's the successor. Then the curriculum and a degree associated with miniature painting gets into place, I think 1982. Right. I joined in 86, so I do remember Bashir saying that in the very beginning he had to fight for that space. Right. And often students which were failing elsewhere were sent to him. Right. So there was this sort of...
if you weren't good enough, then you could go there. Right?
Kind of, which I can understand, I think, because, of course, at KC, Kinnaird College also, you took the elective of Persian because it was an easy way, or accounting, this mentality, which I, unfortunately, at having in that period of convent education, Urdu was the last subject being addressed. Right. So there is this period to understand in terms of where the cultural value lies.
Well, I think that's where the issue of tradition and whose tradition, where does it get placed, is it in contrast to some other dominant thought, is such an important one. And so I want to go to you, Zehra, with that
Zehra is
question.
burning with a question.
I know, yes.
Which has nothing to do with what I'm meant to be talking about.
That's quite all right. Well, what is your question?
So my question is actually has to do with to Shahzia. And it kind of links a little bit with what I want to sort of explore in terms of tradition, but sort of the NCA tradition with Mughal miniatures, and what that particular reading of sort of when you make a contemporary miniature, what is the sort of take on that tradition? How ironic is it, or unironic? And also, I find it very exciting that you mentioned Bashir, but I wondered if there were other teachers as well. For instance, somebody who's now getting a lot of recognition is Zahoor al-Haq, who has a very, what it seems like from the outside to me, being Indian, is like it seems as if Zahoor al-Haq has a particular take on tradition within that Mughal school, which is a little bit ironic. And I wondered whether you would agree with that.
What do you mean ironic? Because Zahoor Sahab was already exploring.
Right.
Actually,
and he understood. I mean, I think of Zahoor al-Haq as more like Swaminathan in the Indian context.
Which is
which has to do with recognizing that it shouldn't be only in the Western context that you explore something.
Yeah, but by ironic, I mean sort of a postmodern irony of kind of quoting something slightly sometimes out of context, like the introduction of the kind of
it's a more self-conscious
way of quotation, something that you do a lot, which is that dialogue between figuration and abstraction.
And you know what we'll do is come back to that question because we're going to look at some of Shahzia's pictures afterwards.
Sorry.
So
back to my own subject.
There you go. No, that's not the reason. But it's just because we will have time. And I'm also mindful of our time, too. So, Zehra, the thing that I think is quite interesting in contrast to what happens at NCA is that in the Indian context, there's lots of debates going on about this new nation. Where is the role of art? Who has a claim to it? Is it going to be kind of neo-nationalist, coming entirely out of tradition, or something different? And obviously the thing that you're preoccupied with these days because of the exhibition too is the progressives. And the very notion of the word progressive, of course, is contested. We won't go there yet. But it seems to me that in India, while there isn't an equivalent of Bashir in any school, Baroda or anywhere except a little bit at Shantiniketan. So talk to us a bit about the progressives and how they're looking at, and I would use not just Mughal, but the painting tradition generally, pre-modern painting tradition, which is also the case at what happens at NCA too. People are not making a distinction, this is Mughal, this is not, I'm not looking at something, like if you think of a Bisarika Naika is a very much out of a non-Muslim tradition, but it doesn't really matter for artists. So talk to us about what happens with the progressives and at that moment of new country that's now, new nation rather, that's being formed?
Well, okay, so there are two things that I kind of want to stress with the progressives, and that is this is the Progressive Artists Group, which is a very specific entity, which is how I'm using the term here. And this is formed,
not progressives broadly speaking.
Yeah, not progressives broadly speaking, and the fact that they use the term Progressive Artist Group to define themselves in 1947, there were 6 of them, so that's Souza, Ara, Hussein, and Gade, and Bakre. And a lot of these, Bakre and Gade and Ara, sort of tend to get left out, especially Gade and Bakre, and sort of sidelined because the others become so famous. And then there's a second wave that kind of joins them in the 50s. But the most famous of this lot, and the people who kind of tend to define the group are Hussein, Souza, Raza in different terms. And Souza very much sort of takes the mantle of being the person who does the most writing on the group, bosses everybody around, and writes on why they call themselves the progressives. And after they form in 1947, post Indian independence and post-partition, which is kind of important, he is very kind of unsure of how that term relates to a Marxist tradition of working. And what he wants is that he says, we've used this term progressive, but I think this is a very stupid term because we're no longer Marxist, and that's just boring. And what we are is about an investigation of form. But this form becomes, I think, important to remember, increasingly political. But it's a particular version of an Indian nation that they're sort of thinking around, and it's a Bombay. It's kind of Bombay-centric in the sense that this definition of the nation in India is very cosmopolitan. Right. It's all about syncretic mixing of traditions.
And in a way, you could say if Lahore is the Palimpsest,
exactly.
Bombay is the Palimpsest of the
and it's a port city. So in some ways, closer to perhaps even Karachi, no? Right. In that kind of deliberately sort of mixing things up. And it's got an angle to tradition. And what's very often been forgotten when you're looking at this group is that, they have a slogan which is like the new art for the new India, right? But this newness actually does not throw out tradition at all.
And that's different from what most people think of progressives because of Raza talking later on, right?
Yeah, because of Raza, because of Souza, who is so dismissive about the past, supposedly. Right. But then all of these guys, so while we don't have a sort of Bashir-type figure, the person who is getting a lot of attention now, like absolutely now, because he's never really been looked at much, is somebody called Professor Jagannath Ahivasi. And this guy is teaching Bahari painting, and you can see his work on the left, I think, that one, the message, and he's sort of absorbing Bahari painting into his work, and he's a teacher to the first wave of progressives as well as Gaitonde, who you can see there. And I mean, you can see the parallels really strongly. And if you know about Gaitonde now, you think of him purely in abstract terms. And so this particular period of Gaitonde is kind of completely forgotten. So we get into this whole dialogue of what is modern and what is new, and totally forget that actually the roots of the new in these terms is actually looking at older traditions, and it is looking at the Mughal, but with a very specific definition of even the kind of Mughal that's being looked at. Because, I mean, this is something Vishakha and I were talking a lot about, whether Bahari painting can even be called late Mughal style, which probably not a good idea, according to Vishakha.
Because the reason for those of us who were trained in traditional art history
Yeah.
We would say late Mughal means really late Mughal.
Yeah.
Meaning Delhi,
Coming out of
Lucknow,
Delhi, exactly.
that milieu.
Yep.
Yeah.
Pahari picture is influenced
Yeah.
by Mughal, but you cannot
Say
call it late Mughal.
late Mughal.
But the point, that's not for all of you to pay attention to, but the reality being is that what we're really talking about is the syncretic tradition and
Absolutely.
ways things come
Yeah.
in and out.
Yeah.
And then the naming
Yeah.
should be something that actually doesn't close discussion.
Yeah.
But naming is something that helps you understand
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
So what you're looking at, and that's why I was saying even at NCA, the thing that was very interesting to me is that visual images from all sorts began to be available. And that's when we can come back to Shahzia's work, that it is no longer about whether this is a Mughal motif, and motif is one thing, style is another. So when you look at the Ahivasi picture, that just to go back one more step, the previous one, or you can talk about this, it's fine. So I think this
it's just
notion
that
of progressives also making a complete break
Yeah.
is actually
Not
a misnomer.
true.
That's the idea.
It's not true.
So go ahead, and your next.
Yeah, so this is, and I think part of the reason that, I'm quite interested in looking at these kind of influences is because you kind of get an idea of the sort of India that they're conceiving of.
Right.
And if you think about it, Hussein's family left for Pakistan, he didn't. Same with Raza, whose brother was a painter as well and was, I think, part of the Lahore art circle. And they sort of were in contact with each other, but apparently the fact that they were in these two nations meant there was quite a lot of friction between them because of their
Because those who
various
chose not
policies.
to go and
Those who chose not to go.
Yeah.
And Raza gets increasingly difficult to define in sort of Islamic terms. And he wants to do that. He wants to get away from being the resident Muslim artist who didn't leave.
Right.
And the same thing happens with Hussein,
for sure.
who then, as we all know, that Hussein is then forced to leave India and he goes into exile because of the Hindu right sort of starts attacking
But I
him.
think that out of this discussion that you're getting at, what is so important is that there are artists who refuse to be defined by their religious identity.
Yes.
But the world around them
Exactly.
says,
Yeah.
at one point or another,
Yeah.
that's what it's about. And that's exactly where the Hussein issue later on comes in.
Yeah,
So I
absolutely.
think that we want to really stay with that idea of how artists look at form, whether it's Hussein looking at Basholi picture, or you have another image as well of Chaur Panchashika later on, right?
Yeah, let me see.
The artist will look at everything.
That's the point.
And as an artist, I feel like, why shouldn't I?
Exactly.
But the frustration of categories
Right.
is obviously, one understands that it's going to always happen.
Right.
It's how the work navigates those
That's
categories
right.
is very important.
Right.
And I think we have to talk about capital, like money.
Right.
A bedfellow with art, patronage, you
Absolutely.
brought up. Without talking about these things, you don't necessarily talk about how somebody gets more attention versus not.
Right.
These-
And
these
therefore, there
pages-
is
this
something
an important
about
thing.
intention, where the artist creates something, and then there is reception.
Yeah.
How is it received? In what circles is it received? And who gets to decide where it's received?
Yeah, and Hussein injects a very populist
Right.
notion in his art, which I think is a great strategy
Right.
in terms of his trajectory.
Right.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, it's also interesting that early Hussein is very different from later Hussein.
Right.
And I mean, my personal favorite is 50s,
Yeah, me too.
possibly
Absolutely.
60s Hussein. Maybe he makes 70s,
And a little
but after
watercolors.
that,
I agree.
that's it.
Right.
As far as I'm concerned, and this is the period of Hussein where he's drawing most from Bashali painting, and you can actually see that. And so while it is true that artists get from everywhere, isn't it interesting that it should be an Indian artist who is a practicing Muslim at this point, and perhaps like throughout, is not looking at earlier styles, but he's specifically looking at Bashali.
Right.
And
or Mewar.
Mewar, and the bits of Bashali that also, like, you can make a connection with giant painting.
Right.
So it's a deliberately syncretic vision of India, as it were.
But that is it seems to me that one of the things about progressives is it's in the milieu of what is the idea of India.
Exactly.
And that's with the intellectuals, progressive writers group, progressive visual groups. But I think that there is something about the freedom of artists on the one hand, and then the idea of a culture or a nation that they want to propagate is another. That's the consciousness, right?
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because you have those ideas which, you know, the artists are engaging with, but then as artists, you're always thinking about aesthetic and the aesthetic that you want to get across. And I think it's quite interesting then with something like the Bisholi painting, like the Bahari painting. It's got such a specific aesthetic to it, which differentiates it from the earlier, you know, Mughal material, some of the other Rajasthani courts as well. So it's a very...
And it's a conscious choice.
It's a very selective process,
exactly.
Yeah. It's a very conscious choice that these individuals are using when they, you know, when they're picking what they want to pull from and draw from. And I presume it's happening, you know, with the contemporary artists as well. The sources that they're drawing from, and you know, when we look at some of Shazia's imagery, we're going to see the different, you know, elements which come into play as well.
We want to move right to that, Shazia. But I think that the issue you're raising that's really important is that sometimes it's very conscious selection for some reason. Other times it may be, and I think, Shazia, I want you to kind of talk about that. Sometimes it may not be a conscious in the sense of content, but conscious in terms of form and how you navigate the specific intent and meaning versus interest in a form. So, for example, Picasso might look at an African piece, not necessarily there is any other political consciousness, but there is something about that form that really appeals to him for where he wants to get at. So talk a bit about your work as...
I can't move. I think it's the last image.
No, it shouldn't be.
But I think, obviously, one is looking aesthetically at the forms, but one is very aware of the political environment.
Shazia's images.
Yeah, what happened to Shazia's?
They're there. Yeah. You had it upside down.
You're upside down. There you go.
All right.
There. Thank you.
Moment of panic. Thank you.
Out of the hundreds of images, sort of we pulled this one out because maybe there was a visual link, easy link to the Mughal aesthetic.
And especially the darbars.
Exactly, the idea of the darbar.
So which again is problematic because it's a very cliche.
Right.
But I think at the same time, what I was interested in when I started to sort of misplaced chronologically data was also to how to bring this idea of justice. You know, justice in terms of all of this, in terms of history writing, in terms of assigning value, in terms of political identities, India, Pakistan. Like growing up in Pakistan in a different generation, you're not that aware of what's going on in India, right? At some level you are, but you cannot just say that it's all interlinked.
No, it's because it's not.
It isn't.
It's not. Sure.
At some point in space, you have to take ownership of the difference, of the separate histories.
Right.
And at the same time, of course, I always felt very strongly that as anybody, we have the right to all the various layers of history. How those histories get written and who gets to write them is obviously debatable. So here I think it's the element of the women. You know, a lot of my work is informed by feminist theorists, whether it's Fatima Mernissi, Helen Sassoon. It was bringing together this idea that how does a woman's voice emerge within perhaps a patriarchal symbolic space. And then when the bodies, I think this was one of the early ventures into kinetic painting. early in the 2000s,
Right,
before
right.
even HD is developed, where the bodies are left aside and a segment of the body, like the hair and the head,
Right.
is left.
Go back to the image just before. It seemed to me one of the things interesting about this particular image, the forms and gestures you take come so much out of actually the gopis and the Krishna themes
Yeah,
and
that's
the kind of images that are much more seen in the Rajput tradition.
Yeah, so like
And
what is
so-
Gopi? It's a
yeah.
stock character.
Exactly, right,
Yeah.
Right?
absolutely.
So if we start focusing too much on the Gopi, we're going to go, oh, Hindu, Muslim.
No, exactly, but no.
Yeah. Right?
No, that's exactly why I wanted to get at it, is that it is actually not about the religious or the content, it's a form.
It is a form, but
Right.
at the same time, it has its history and time and
Time,
space.
right, right.
What I was interested in investigating is that when you share where you're taking the information
Right.
from and yet suspend that idea
Right.
through clarity and through a very transparent process,
Right.
does that element have the ability to propel forward?
Forward, right.
And I think
And not get stuck.
and not get
in
stuck.
only in the original
so
meaning.
when
yeah.
this functions as a particle system, so
Right.
when I do large scale works now, multimedia, this functions as a particle system.
Right.
And when it's coded and written in millions, it can be fluid and static.
Right.
But I'm not interested in changing its inherent shape and form. So the idea is that a
Right.
rigid element
Right.
can be fluid, but at the same time, without sacrificing its difference.
Right.
So it's not about homogeneity.
Right.
It
See,
is really
right.
celebrating
Yeah,
difference.
yeah.
I mean, what's
Just
so
that
interesting
really-
is that initially, Razi, when I saw this title, Lahore is Palimpsest,
Yeah.
and I said, Palimpsest, my God, big word. But it keeps coming back.
Yeah.
What is it? It's about
Yeah.
layers with
Yeah,
differences
yeah.
apparent,
Yeah.
meaning apparent in all of those layers.
But here,
right?
there's
Exactly.
there's a little bit of like the female narrative is free to create its own history.
Right.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the layers are there, but the thing in motion
Right. The fluidity is also
is
there.
very
right?
Yeah.
feminine.
It's not all very specific. It's not like this.
So not
it's like
so
this,
much
right?
categorized, but you put these things into play, as it were, and
Yeah, and this I shared because I think
Yeah, I
it
love it.
showed up here in
Right.
the show we did.
Right.
It
Long
was
time ago,
long time ago.
2001.
So I was doing that exhibition
Right.
with you, and
Right.
September 11th happened.
Right.
And then the show was postponed.
Postponed by a month,
I
yeah.
got my paintings back, so
Right.
I was able to keep working on them.
I know. Of course, typical of Shahzia, it's never finished until finished. And you say, please, just leave it alone.
So some
We
of the
have to
layers
put it
are-
up, right?
So some of those layers, of
Right.
course, are here.
Right.
But here also it's about power hierarchies. It's also about the dynamic, which
Right.
is how do you weave
Right.
the multiplicity into
Right.
a compelling space?
Right.
At the end of the day, the painting has to exist as an object too. It's a painted
Right.
idea.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
how do you keep
So
something
the
which
whole
is very
has to make
precise?
sense in addition to the parts.
Yeah,
which
and
is
when
very
the
important.
precision is a very functional main element,
Right.
precision of iconography
Right.
and precision of language and stylization, how do you keep the narrative open-ended?
Right.
So that 20 years later, it still is, people are still able to engage with it.
Right.
That's
Well,
a
what
tough one.
What I think is quite interesting is that as an art historian, and focusing on the 17th century in particular, I look at your work and I see all those layers, and I see the elements just from a stylistic point of view, a formal point of view, which I can identify as Mughal, as Rajasthani, as Pahari. But they're all, that idea of the layering and seeing it all as one unit. So despite that idea of having that multiplicity, it all melts together. And that what you just mentioned about the fact that in 20 years' time it's still making sense. It works. It works in that way.
Well, I mean, in a strange way, it brings us right back to the early Mughal tradition.
But see,
And that's the
ethos
thing. Yeah.
of it is
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
important.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
not just arbitrarily
Exactly.
taking Photoshop
idea
and putting elements together.
Right.
It is really about
it's an intent. There's an intent.
That's, I think, that is the pursuit, a creative pursuit of all artists.
Exactly.
This filter for truth, to speak through the world, to speak to the world.
And we don't give that agency to the original court artists.
Yes.
But they too ultimately are faced with that.
They are contemporary at that time.
And they're faced with that page and saying, how to make a whole with Mansoor and Keshav and whoever coming in together, 4 people working together with very different traditions, and they're making a whole. You're doing it all by yourself. Pretty cool.
This was interesting. The Lahore Pioneer puts us here.
Just as,
Yes. And sure, no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just finish that because we are going to come to an end and I want to very quickly open it up to the floor.
Yes. So now the piece that I showed is Dakkan.
Right.
You know, it's a manuscript at the Philadelphia Art Museum. So my interpretation is of the Gulshan-e-Ishq.
Right.
But then Dakkan manuscript in Dakkani Urdu also exemplifies a very plural moment in time.
Especially in Deccan,
So what I'm interested in is the provenance. Like how does a lot of this truncated art form get to where it is? How does it get into the storages of the institutions? That history is very powerful because it clearly shares like power hierarchies and who gets to buy and disrupt.
Interpret.
And who gets to select what happens, which is a whole other topic. Right.
But that idea of violence inherent in it, but at the same time, it is indicative of like a time that is, like we have to have many more discussions to even open up the discourse.
No, and I think the problem is that right now we're in a time where oftentimes these discourses are getting limited or narrower. And how do you keep that open, which is exactly what the intent of the Lahore Literary Festival is and why we're all here. So with that, floor is open. Please identify yourself, and I have very little time, so we just take 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll have to bring it to a close. So let's take 2 questions all at the same time. And I can't quite see you, so raise your hand.
Just there.
There's a hand right here. So we'll take 2 questions, and another hand over there, and we'll take that. So we'll take both questions at the same time.
Hi, my name is Naeem. I'm a public librarian from Lahore. I have been in the West for almost 25 years. And what I find as a founding institution in any given culture is the institution of public libraries, which creates some depth in perception and understanding of the world. I mean, Mughals had great architecture, but they didn't believe in perhaps the idea of public education or public libraries. And that is something which is absent, and the effects of that can be seen all over the Islamic world. The rise in tribalism. Yesterday there was an article by Mohsen Hamid that if the world wants to learn about the dangers of tribalism, they should look at Pakistan. And I mean, even in the United States, Noam Chomsky has written a book called Spectacular Achievements of Propaganda.
Excuse me, do you have a question?
Yeah, the question is there any hope to come out of tribalism with the help of art, given the prevailing situation of political and religious propaganda in Pakistan or in the Islamic world?
Great, so we'll take that, and then there's a hand up there.
My question is for Shahzia Sikander. And this is more of a private question rather than working with Bashir Sahab. I'm also an alumni of NCA, and knowing Bashir Sahab, he was quite a traditionalist, as you know, and I've spent hours with him, and he was a wonderful person, but I'm sure it must be a head-butting session, when you were there, because looking at your work, which is pretty progressive to me, and what Bashir Saab does, is more traditional. And his personality was also, as a person, he was a very traditional person. Yeah. So tell me about your uphill battle with him.
Okay, let's take the first question. How do we get beyond tribalism, and where does culture fit into that?
Well,
you have Lahore Literary Festival.
You have the Lahore Biennale. You have,
It's a very, I mean, it's a huge question, and it's a very hard question because you can't. I mean, we're at this amazing event held in its iterations in 3 different countries. Other festivals like this take place. There is an awareness. I think there is a global awareness of the importance of culture and history, and the idea of libraries, as you mentioned, in the promotion of, maybe it's a bit silly to say, but the idea of global harmony. Like we know that the importance of culture gets portrayed in these ways. The current political climate, globally in the Islamic world, as you said,
and even in this country.
Oh God, yeah, it's tense, to put it mildly, and there is a drive by certain factions to destroy cultural heritage, to minimize the importance of culture from an academic point of view, the funding cuts, to departments. There needs to be more of an emphasis on how we can use this cultural past and this historical past to learn lessons and move forward. The point you made about I think you said that libraries in the Islamic world have not been there. Historically, that's not true. There have been incredible libraries.
Modern
I think
libraries.
there should be more patronage. There should be support locally for the arts, whether it's in Lahore or New York. We're fighting in the same
right.
way.
I mean, I think that the real question that you're raising is that, and a number of philosophers have written about that, is that it's exactly when borders begin to break, as in globalization, is when balkanization also occurs. People want to hold on to the smaller and smaller units, and people who are threatened by the first will push this.
Yeah.
What that means that all of us who really believe that is not where we want to be, we got to fight. And it is now an urgent act of resistance and creating an alternative way, which is about palimpsest. It is about layering. It is about not using cultural history for narrow vision and narrow interpretation. That's a big task, but it is urgent because everywhere the pressures are huge. And you're right about that.
And it's not just, I feel like and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like your question was stressing this within a context of the Islamic world, which is really, unfair, because if you just look at what's happening in India now.
That's happening here.
Yeah, I know it's happening here,
and
but
also what's happening in the
India,
UK as well.
Yeah.
And it's almost like the attack at some level is to culture itself, right?
Yeah.
As the fact that we're, in a way, not allowed to have a space for discussion, and that these things can be talked about. It's just not one narrow definition which fits into one line. And that's not just the Islamic world.
No,
Last word goes to you, Shahzia, vis-a-vis the...
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that overt nationalism always is problematic because it does attack women. It always is interested in taking ownership of women's bodies. So in that respect, of course, I think you have seen current movements that have emerged. There's far more voices from that space globally. So we need to support that too. And in terms of I think Lahore Biennial was a good example because I think they did raise a level of interest locally within the government to help support. So they were able to see where the potential lies. So a lot of those shifts have to happen locally too, which gives out a very different message to everybody there as well as outward. And that type of internal dismantling has to happen by a collective space.
So your question
so
you will answer offline.
So I think in that sense, Bashir has a function. Bashir was responsible to put into place a curriculum for the traditional miniature painting. So he feels that I felt that was his responsibility. So he could only, explore so much. That was not his role. In terms of how one navigates that situation as a young artist is very different from how one evolves over time. But even at that time, learning the craft and the skills was never problematic. I was eager to learn, but I was also being nurtured and fostered by many other teachers and students mentors, right? And histories and literatures and poetry. And so all of that allows you to know in how much of the mix is essential. Yeah. It doesn't put you imprisons you. I think it's
and not be dependent on one. Yeah.
So I felt the frustration, of course, of like making a painting that can take a year is obviously there, and at some point quite unrealistic. If you ask me, like how does that move forward in the way things function in the time and space that we are in? But at the same time, confinement allows you to imagine freedom. And if it's not that, it'll be another thing. So that premise is continuous, I think, for me.
So I think we have come to the end of the program, but I hope that you do think about these words like palimpsest, fluidity, whole and the parts, and flexibility.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.